plug your test for now. What? Yes. Alright, Tristan. Probably shouldn't make jokes like that. Anyway. Alright, and then bring this every day. This is our new book. Okay. Now, with this book versus the other book I think was it was meant for a public audience. It was very clear language. I think maybe probably needed a little more complexity to it. I think that he rehashes a lot of his arguments, but I still think it is valuable. Also, not only to look at the conflict theory view of media, but also compare it to the pluralist view or the functionalist view. I think obviously we discussed this before. I think there's cases for both. There's certainly open areas in the media that the media monopoly has not yet conquered. But again, you can see some of the things that are going on with the SOPA bill in the future of this. This is both on many ways a conflict perspective, but in some ways also, if you look at the criticism levied at what is called cultivation theory, which is what we're going to be talking about. But the proofs against cultivation theory back up some of the claims of the pluralist theory. Okay, we'll talk about what this is today. Today, one of the things you want to do now is make sure you write down the page numbers of the things that I read. I'm not going to write everything up on the chalkboard. Okay, I do have some of this stuff on slideshows. We'll use it later when we're talking about the evolution of the theory and how it changed over time, criticisms of the theory. I think on the face of it is a very simple idea to get down to understand cultivation theory, but I think on some levels, some of the more complex iterations or revisions of the theory, including things what are called mainstreaming, also the interpretation model or the active audience model, where cultivation theory posits an idea that television has broad, long-term effects on people's outlook of the social environment. There's also a theory that sort of neutralizes part of that in the sense that, look, each one of us decides what content we allow and what ideas based on media content get inside our personality or are internalized by our value system. And look, if you choose to behave like Lady Gaga, that's your choice. And nobody held a gun to your head, or if you choose to buy a product because a commercial says so, then that's your issue as well. If you like to watch crime shows and it makes you paranoid about crime, which is one of the ideas that comes across in cultivation theory. Some people say that's your own fault. You're not fully understanding that the stuff on Criminal Minds is not real. Or if it is real, it's much less common than they make it appear on television. And we'll talk one of the issues here, one of the main issues with television itself, and more importantly with fiction versus the news, or fiction and the news, is that because of the proliferation of channels on cable television, companies are in intense competition with each other, even though we have this monopoly aspect. And when we talked about the media monopoly, what the media monopoly itself does to content, and one of the things it does is it leads to the construction or the creation of highly profitable content. And highly profitable content in a visual medium, an audio-visual medium, is things that can sell as far as sex and violence are concerned. That things that are sexual from a visual standpoint and things that are violent, visually violent, and then add sound into it, hold the most attraction for the most viewers. And the problem with the news is they're impacted by that reality, so they have to show, in the minds of many people, questionable things that don't have to do with society, that are very small micro stories. Somebody, a family being murdered. Again, the school shooting in Ohio. Did the world end because there was a school shooting in Ohio? Did any legislation take place? Are people now not going to high schools anymore? Do you see that why that's not an important story for a local news station in New York to be discussing? Why that's a distract? But why do they do it? Because it's like a CSI episode or Criminal Minds, isn't it? It's a horror movie. And I'll tell you right now, a lot of news agencies, especially national news agencies like CNN, do they show blood and dead bodies on TV? Does the news show actual dead bodies, which a lot of people consider to be a form of obscenity? Do they show dead bodies on TV? Yeah, they do. Take a look at it next time. And they'll certainly show dead Iraqis. No problem there. They showed Saddam Hussein's son's bodies on TV. They'll show dead bodies. They'll show blood on the sidewalk. You tell me that none of you have ever seen a news story where there was blood on the sidewalk? On the ground? I'm telling you right now, go and take a look, Tristan, okay, at news stories. And tell me they don't show dead people on TV. Okay? But again, should they, well, what's the point of, look, if a murder takes place, I know there's a dead body. You have to ask yourself why they show it. Okay? And cultivation theory asks the question, well, what's the, if the media, news and fiction, both deal, and let's face it, if you look at the top TV shows, CSI, Law and Order are almost always at the top of the list. Horror movies do really well in the movies, action, adventure movies where people get killed, mysteries, like crime mystery movies and things like that. That one of the things they asked was, what is the impact of particularly all this violent behavior on the viewers of television, especially heavy viewers of television? And they started out with a theory that watching violence on TV will make you violent. And so they started out with this idea that heavy amounts of TV, because there's a lot of violent content, will lead to acts of violence. And you can see that really was kind of a silly notion, because if you actually look at it, when TV came around in the 1950s, the murder rate went down. And I'm not saying that TV stopped murder, but if people were watching more crime and violence on TV, and the expected theoretical direction means that it should elevate violence in society, it certainly didn't show up in the statistics. Yes?
Well, in the 1950s, wasn't TV not really violent at all?
Well, it probably wasn't as graphic as it is now, but westerns were everywhere where people shot people, crime dramas were everywhere, Police and crime dramas were very, very popular, both in the movies and television. But you're right, to some extent there's variety shows. But let's fast forward to the 60s. We have shows like Dragnet, or these cop shows, or the evolution of action-adventure movies in the 70s and 80s. Or for example, just in the 80s and 90s, studies showed that television and movies particularly got increasingly more violent in the 80s and 90s, while the murder rate was dropping, particularly in New York by 45%. From 1977 to when the murder rate in the I'm trying to remember the exact figure. I want to say there was about 2,200 murders in New York in the 5 boroughs in the late 1970s. That now drops, I believe it's around 1,200, which is still 3 or 4 a day. Which, to compare, maybe it's not completely fair, if you go to Des Moines, Iowa, there's like 1 murder every 3 years. Seriously. In my hometown of Columbus, there might be 50 murders in an entire year, and that's a weird year. And it's mostly gang-related. It's not strange people blowing each other's brains out because someone flipped them the finger on the southern state or something like that. And unfortunately, that's the kind of stuff that goes on around here. That people get into arguments about, and this is any big city, Chicago and whatever. Somebody steps on someone's foot, or somebody says something to somebody's girlfriend in a bar, and guns come out. And that's why one of the reasons why the murder rate is so high in New York City. But the idea is, in the 80s and 90s, if violence on television and movies is going up, shouldn't violence in society go up? But one of the things they found out was, instead of this, it led to a fear of crime. It made people overestimate the amount of crime. One of the things here is, this idea here is that, look, TV presents a distorted version of reality. Most crime shows talk about what types of crime. There's only one real type of crime that crime shows deal with on CSI and Law and Order. What usually is the person accused of.
Homicide? Yeah,
or rape and murder or kidnapping, and it's usually something violent, nasty, a nasty crime. It's not. Or does anybody watch these shows regularly? Law and Order CSI. Have they ever had a Bernie Madoff-like episode where they got a white-collar criminal who didn't kill anybody but he robbed everybody? I bet Mets fans would like to see that. That's just not sexy, right? There's no dead body. I'll tell you right now, I would like to see Law and Order take up a fraud case or a corruption case or like Richard Nixon kind of stuff, or a president got accused of something like that. But they won't do it. And so what it does is it gives people who watch these shows the idea that murder is much more common than it is in reality. And what their early research showed was that the more crime, particularly crime dramas, but in general just television, the heavier people viewed television, the more they distrusted strangers, the more they supported the, we'll go through each one of these later in detail. The more they supported the death penalty and the expansion of the death penalty, the more likely they were to have a security system on their house, and the more likely they were to overestimate the crime rate. And also think that the murder rate was going up. So it's interesting that television can have that type of effect. And it reminds me of The Matrix. When you're inside the television world, that's what the world seems like. And when you watch shows like Criminal Minds, and then you watch here's how it works partly. Partly is effect of the fictionalized violence on TV, but then that gets backed up on the news, because the news has to compete with CSI. They have to get your attention. So they lead with 3 murders. And maybe it's the only 3 murders in that town, and let's say if it's a small town, in 2 or 3 months, right? But it makes it look like, because it's prominently placed in the news, that it's a lot more common than it really is. So people get scared, right? Like if the news just sit there and every single day if Channel 12 talked about, no new arrests in the Gilgo Beach serial killer murders. He's out there somewhere. Let's interview the police chief of Nassau County. Yeah, people should take caution. There's definitely a serial killer on the loose. We have no idea who he is. He could be anybody. He could be a member of your family. That's the type of stuff that the news likes to deal in. Why do you think they like to connect crime to you specifically in your life and to the larger community? Although they never talk about crime rates usually. So they don't put it in context. Why do you think they like to put it in a very personal manner, like with a serial killer? Try to warn people. Why do you think they do that kind of stuff? What? Scare you? Why? So you'll do what later? Tomorrow. So you'll do what tomorrow? Yeah.
You just said go back and watch it.
Yeah, so you tune in. No new development. He's still out there. Stay right here on Channel 5 for any of the latest updates. Right? Are you starting to see who the news is, who they are? Are they concerned about informing the public in a contextualized manner so you can make good decisions as a citizen? Is that what the news is engaged in? Or are they just profit-mongering whores who will sell anything to anybody? They remind me like people who were like selling patent medicine in the 1890s. They put heroin and morphine and all this dope inside of a liver tonic. And yeah, people would feel good for a little while, wouldn't they? Because they were jacked up on morphine. But after they came down, they still had the same liver problem. Right? And that's what the news is. The news is like some kind of emotional roller coaster. It's like emotional weather, isn't it? They're trying to disrupt you. They're trying to put clouds in into your sunset or something like that, or a rainy day or something. Anyway. So let's actually talk more specifically of some of the things that cultivation theorists are interested in looking at. One, it is primarily focused on television, and you see this on page 20 and 21. Let me read this for you here. It says here at the beginning of chapter 2, as we described in the previous chapter, cultivation emerged in the shadow of 2 contrary historical trends, while the prevailing intellectual discourse held that media effects were, at most, limited. Heightened concern about television and violence dominated public and congressional discourse, so the government was involved in this. It was in this atmosphere that George Gerbner, I believe the other guy's name is Michael Gross, I could be wrong about that, but the other guy, George Gerbner's the founder of this type of research, built up their case against both the prevailing apologia and the more simplistic monkey-see, monkey-do violence hysteria of the day, meaning that people would watch, kids especially would watch violence on TV and act it out, which there's actually some evidence that kids do that kids under 8 tend to do mimetic violence, especially when they watch things like where the violence is legitimized or it looks fun, like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers, if you've ever seen this ridiculous show, where it's not only violent, but it's like sped up, hyper violent, and like people don't actually hit each other, so no one really gets hurt. And if you look at most cartoons, if you go back and look at a cartoon like G.I. Joe from the 1980s, there was never any blood on that show. Like people would get hit by lasers and fall down. So it was very unrealistic the way violence was presented. So that type of violence, or like Tom and Jerry violence, where Tom throws a stick of dynamite down his mouth and he blows up, and then 5 minutes later he's running down the street again, right? Or someone gets smashed by an anvil, and they're walking like an accordion. That type of stuff does impact young people's impression. There was a very famous case of Beavis and Butthead where a kid was watching an episode called Frog Baseball, where they were playing baseball with a frog, and supposedly, I guess a 6 or 7 year old was watching, probably shouldn't be watching Beavis and Butthead, and they went in and clubbed his brother in the head with a baseball bat. So, and they tried to blame that on Beavis and Butthead. I'd be like, I think blame it on you for leaving a baseball sitting around with a 5 or 6 year old. I mean, what are you doing? Why don't you just give him a nail gun too? Yeah, I know. And why is an 8-year-old watching Beavis and Butthead? I mean, my gosh. Again, that speaks to what we were talking about as far as, remember at the beginning of the class when we talked about how much media kids use, and when there's parental controls, is a big drop-off in the type, not only in the amount of media, but the type of media that young people are exposed to. And we will talk, I'll bring in some additional evidence, and they talk about in here, the harm that's done when children, especially children under the age of 10 or even under the age of 12, when they're exposed to R-rated films, whether with sexual content, drug and alcohol content, or violent content, that this can have long-term impacts on their personality development and their behaviors later on, particularly when we mix it in with peer groups, where friends are doing these behaviors. It's not good. It's not enough to where a 12-year-old will watch Superbad and start drinking. It's that they would watch Superbad with their friends who would bring over alcohol. And then it becomes. And this is why this movie Project X concerns me. Okay, which it was described. If you haven't seen the previews for this movie, it was described as Superbad on crack. I don't think Superbad need to be on crack, because if you've ever seen Superbad, it's a pretty insane movie. But this one looks like an invitation for kids who are already thinking of throwing a house party to make it go crazy, and just as importantly, to put it on YouTube. Right? Like one of the plots of this movie is that this party gets on YouTube, and Jimmy Kimmel's talking about it on the show or something like that. It'll be interesting. I'll probably go see this just as a critic, although I'll probably do it in the middle of the day, because if you go see this movie on Friday or Saturday night, you can bet 80% of the audience is going to be on something. And I'd be surprised if it's only 80%. There might be some designated drivers in the audience. Anyway, I would be careful driving home from a screening of that on midnight on Friday, seriously. But anyway, their initial empirical testing of cultivation in the mid-1970s grew out of these arguments about the nature of television and its role in society, although these assumptions have been questioned by many. And despite some obvious institutional and technological changes in television, like cable television in particular, and now the internet and with the DVR, these starting points should nevertheless be reiterated briefly. So here's some of the assumptions they started with when they sought to try and understand what the violence on television does to all people, but particularly young people. So they say here, first, overall amount of exposure to television dwarfs the use of most other media for most people. That's true still today, but among your generation and even younger, the internet has started to dominate. The one thing is though, why isn't television more concerned about the internet? What do most people do on the internet? What? What do most people do on the internet? Remember we showed this. What do most people do on the internet? What do you guys do on the internet?
Go on like YouTube and social networks?
Yeah, and maybe you watch a video. Maybe it's a video your friend made. Maybe it's an episode of a TV show. Like how many people here you watch TV shows online? How many people here you watch movies online or download them? How many people have a Netflix account? Some of you. So what do you guys just get DVDs then? Because some of you.
Yeah, I just get DVDs and watch Netflix.
How many people here go on Hulu? Right? So, how many people, that's the only place you watch TV is the internet. See? So the TV's still very important. And again, we are heading towards, and I don't know what it's going to look like, because you already got smart TVs now, which can go online. You can open your Facebook page while you're watching, while you're watching TV and stuff. I don't have one of these things. We are getting to the point, and Apple's trying to work on Apple TV too. And right now there's a thing called Slingbox where you can watch your cable off your phone.
Doesn't Apple have Apple TV?
They do, but I don't know how extensive it is. Don't you have an iPad?
Yeah.
Does it have an app for it?
What?
For Apple TV? Can't you get that on your
Doesn't
iPad?
have like an Apple TV.
Oh, they have a separate screen thing
Yeah,
for
but
it?
it's like... It's
Would it make sense for them to run it out of their iPad?
Category, though.
Well, that's the thing. I don't know how far they've developed it unless, and here's the problem. Apple now has to go get permission from each one of these media companies that owns these channels. Like if they want to show MTV, they got to go kiss Viacom's ass. And I don't think Steve Jobs and the people that are like him, if he was still alive, are going to sit there and put up with paying Time Warner money so they can, or MSG or one of these channels money, because they've already had enough problems. I mean, if you're a Knicks fan, you probably don't like Time Warner very much because they screwed up the first part of this. If you're a Rangers, wasn't the Rangers too were blacked out? So Apple would have to face the same reality. If they wanted the Stars channel, or if they wanted Oprah's network, if they wanted FX, if they wanted TBS, they would have to deal with each one of these companies. They'd have to go. The best thing for them to do is be hook up with an organization like Disney, and then try and pry their way open into these other ones, because Disney owns so much on cable television. Disney and Viacom alone, you could probably wrap up 200 channels, or at least maybe 100, 120 of the best channels. Because there's a lot. Look, those of you know this. Those of you who have cable, which is probably almost everybody in here. There's some thousands goofy channels. I might watch 20 of them. Seriously. And I'm sitting here paying for 180 channels that I wouldn't turn on unless you paid me, for the most part. I'm not turning on, some of these shows. I'm certainly not watching the Oprah Network, which right now nobody is. Poor Oprah. She should have figured it out. Is Jerry Springer still on?
Yeah.
He's from my home state too. He's from Cincinnati. People from Cincinnati are weird. Anyway. People simply do not, on average, spend as much time with other media or in other leisure pursuits as they spend with television. It's the #1 leisure pursuit. You know what's interesting? You know what the #2 leisure activity is? And I don't know why this is considered leisure activity. Shopping.
That's fun. You don't like shopping?
To some... I find it to be annoying. I don't like going into stores. I especially don't like going to stores when it's busy. And many times it's only the weekend. Like when I go to Tanger Outlet, I plan out exactly what I'm going to do. Go in and get the clothes and leave. I have no interest in hanging around or looking at and grabbing everything off the rack. I have no interest in that. Same when I go into the supermarket. I don't like the experience of the supermarket. It's like some kind of crisis of consciousness going in there. I don't know what that is. That's weird. The supermarket to me is a weird place. So.
Order your food online. Teapot.
Yeah, that's true. You could do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the one bad thing about clothes shopping. You can order clothes online, but the chances that they're not going to fit are probably pretty high. Because sizes are different and things like that. But in general, I think most people would agree with you, Tristan, and Americans would, that shopping is fun. Shopping is something you do with other people. Shopping is a social event. Shopping is not just going to the mall. It's going to the mall and looking at other people and showing yourself off. Maybe getting a date or flirting with somebody. Especially for younger people, the mall is still, even with online shopping, still very important sort of social environment where people conglomerate and discuss things. And like I said, for me, I like to limit my time shopping. Other people, they'll go shopping for an entire day on Saturday.
It's like a form of therapy, too, for some people.
Yeah, maybe we can talk about materialism and affluenza, because one of the things that they've looked at on some of the studies is that television seems to cultivate materialistic attitudes to some extent, and that's certainly something psychologists have looked at, this idea that shopping is sort of a drug, that it releases hormones in your brain, and they've shown that it's pretty conclusive that it acts almost like a drug. And so people look at this as like, maybe not, I would call it a neurosis or something like that, but certainly something in an area of, one of the definitions of materialism is does it make you happy to shop? And if it makes you happier than like doing things like volunteer work or accomplishing something at your job, then it's probably a sign that you have a high level of materialism, at least when it regards to shopping. Now, it doesn't mean that just because you like shopping that you're a completely materialistic person, but it certainly is an indication of it. But again, so television, is television related to shopping? I mean, think about it. Yeah, I mean, television, there's only one reason why television exists. What is it? To entertain people?
Commercials?
Yeah, it only exists to sell things. The only channel that don't are PBS, but they still show commercials. You know? And I remember cable television didn't used to be this way. When cable television first started out, it was like the internet when it first started out. There were no commercials at all on MTV, on Nickelodeon, on any of these channels. It was beautiful. It was like the golden age of Greece or something like that. When they built the Parthenon. Now they're probably going to have to sell it to the highest bidder. Anyway, there are, of course, voracious readers, movie fanatics, mouse potatoes. I don't even know what the hell that means. I think that meant house potatoes. I don't even know what that means. Web surfers, magazine devotees, and those who never turn off the radio, whether they're wearing it as headgear. Now, that's even more the case now. But for most people, television dominates the media diet. Second, exposure to television begins when before we first used most other media. Think about that. I mean, as a kid, or even as a toddler or a newborn, they sit you in front of the TV. Most people under 50 have been watching TV since before they could read or probably even speak. Most people probably learned to speak from the television, or at least part of how they learn to speak. For almost everyone, television viewing begins before we develop the taste and selective patterns of consumption that we apply to other media. Usage patterns for other media are informed by the fact of being born into households where television is virtually a member of the family. Children enter kindergarten, their first form of exposure to the official public sphere, as already experienced viewers with thousands of viewing hours under their belts. And guess what's in the classroom with them? I mean, you ever been to a kindergarten class? I would assume that half the day is probably taken up with videos or some kind of thing, like, especially now, right? Is anybody here teaching kindergarten or anything?
It's pre-CAD.
What's it like? Do they show a lot of videos to entertain, or at least to get, you know, because look,
They
taking
show
care
like
of,
Disney films when like my kids act up, like the teacher will say, just put on a Disney film.
right, or some kind of cartoon, right? Yeah, so Dora the Explorer, something like anything that bounces around and is colorful. Kids are a bit like. I mean, it's similar. Kids are a bit like puppies. You throw something and they'll go running after it. I mean, they're really attracted to bright objects. They're attracted to things that move very quickly. That's why they love video games. And this actually continues way up into your teens. That you're attracted by quickly moving things. I mean, I'm not trying to insult human beings by saying that, but I mean, look, it's actually a mechanism that's used to protect you. If you weren't attracted to quick moving things and something's coming at your head, you're not going to live very long, are you? You know, think about it. So our attention span is actually meant to grab things that are that way. That's why fruits are brightly colored. We're just like any other animal, you know, on a lot of levels. Although bees and stuff can see infrared. So.
What?
Bees can see infrared. Or ultraviolet. My fault. Ultraviolet. Sharks can actually see electrical impulses, like from your spine. Anyway, so we don't have the greatest vision, but we're still attracted to those types of things. So what they're trying to say here is that it's very difficult to tell where the effects of television begin. How do we analyze what these impacts are? Is it easy to ask a 2-year-old what they think of television? Right? Can you remember what television did to you from 0 to 5? I assure you liked it. It's like McDonald's. McDonald's does a very good job of inculcating children into, like, they want, the one thing they want kids to grow up with is the word McDonald with positive feelings. If they can get that connection, they got you. Even if you grow up and you realize that the food's really not that good for you and stuff, you'll still go there. I bet almost everybody in this room has went to McDonald's in the past month. Part also is an economy measure, right? Dollar menu. So what they're trying to figure out is what is the impact of television since it is in our lives from the very beginning. Their interactions with most out-of-the-home agencies and institutions and the contributions of those institutions to belief and behavior are colored by that earlier exposure. Third, Television is more available and accessible than most other media. Unlike print media, television does not require literacy. Matter of fact, some people would say that it damages literacy. Unlike theatrical movies, I would say what's damaging literacy right now is texting and IMing. People shouldn't say out loud, OMG. It's not a word. That's what an English purist would say. I don't know how I completely feel about that, but I don't want to hear people, my friends don't talk in text abbreviations. So. And one thing, it does damage at least your ability to write in full sentences, I think, to some extent, but we'll see. Unlike theatrical movies, television runs almost continuously. There's another element. It used to be, earlier, the bad old days of television, it would go off at like midnight and you get this test pattern on the screen. Seriously, or it'd just be snow, you know, like the fuzz or whatever. Unlike radio, television can show as well as tell. There's another one. Visual images, very powerful. We're very visual animals. That's the thing about the brightly colored objects. Unlike the internet, television does not require computer skills. Or a computer. Relatively expensive equipment or focused interaction from the audience member. Most of all, Gerbner and Gross argued that television is different from other media in its centralized mass production and ritualistic use of a coherent set of images and messages produced to appeal to virtually the entire population. And there's where that idea of coherent set of images and messages. Sex and violence. Or at least sensationalism, right? Something interesting. If you're going to have a TV show, you can't be boring. Can you? That's the worst sin in the world on television, isn't it? They'll cancel you the next day. You know? I mean, even somebody like that people consider to be somewhat funny, like Jay Leno, he wasn't funny enough. They almost canceled him. Right? Or Oprah. Why is her new show not doing well? Maybe she did a new format or something. Maybe it's just the fact she's on this new network. Okay? Anyway, despite the growth of new technologies and the explosion of channels since the early 1970s, television remains the dominant purveyor of stories and messages shared across, listen to this. So these are all the subject matters, and not just violence and sex. And we'll talk about television and stereotypes, and yes, Knicks fans, we will talk about Jeremy Lin, okay? It will happen. We'll also talk more broadly about race in the NBA and race in sports, okay? Because 78% of the league is African American, okay? Maybe we'll talk about Novak. Isn't he the one who, didn't he hit 5 feet? Anyway. Cleveland's terrible, so Knicks fans, don't get too crazy. I mean, they're rotten. But anyway, dealing with issues of class, gender, race, age, religion, geography, ethnicity, sexuality, and so on, what were formerly the most massive mass media radio and magazines now make profits by reaching and cultivating fragmented, sharply defined, specific audiences. The television audience has become more fragmented in the 1990s as well, but not nearly to the same extent, and the vast majority of audience concentrates its viewing on a small number of channels showing network-type fare. Even with all of the new content, still most people watch the 4 major networks. How many here, your favorite shows on either CBS, ABC, NBC, or Fox? None of you? How many of you it's on cable? The rest of you don't have a favorite show. Right? Anyway. Alright, so they're wrong about that. For the advertiser, the storyteller, and the average audience member, television remains the medium that caters to the largest possible, most general audience. And when you appeal to the lowest common denominator, look what types of material you get, right? Cable is changing, the specific cable channels are changing this. You know, the History Channel appeals to a specific genre and viewer. But I will tell you right now, if you go to the History Channel, you're going to find stuff like, they'll do the history of sex, or the history of war, or they'll talk about World War II. Right? So how much different is there? Even though it's in a different format, it's not CSI, but it's not much different, right? It's blood and bodies. And back to the comment you were making, Tristan, about body and blood on TV. Don't you think they show it on the History Channel? You ever seen those War to War documentaries? It's nasty. Watch the one on the Final Solution. I mean, that's a horror show. You know, I mean, and it's real too. And I think that's what makes it so powerful. The CSI Criminal Minds stuff, or horror shows. Horror shows are almost comedy, aren't they? Some of them, like the Halloween series, that's comedy. It's not realistic. It's goofy. It follows like a cliche pop. You know that. Don't open that door. You know, I mean, you know, it's like a big joke. That's why they made Scary Movie. It's because it's a big, gigantic joke that it's fake-looking violence. And didn't anybody see this movie, The Expendables, right? There was a scene in there where somebody jammed like a spear or something all the way through this guy's body, and it came out the other side, and it was like you could see like the plastic and all kinds of stuff. It's like when you see like special effects and you can see the strings. That's the way horror movies come across. Other of them are more frightening. You know, Saw is probably one that people don't. You know, it's like one of those nightmares that people have or something like that, where Jason is like this immortal. They made it into a joke. He never dies. You know, I mean, he's some kind of a zombie or something. And there's been several movies where they took his mask off, which is absolutely idiots. But anyway, so again, even in the History Channel or other channels, the Biography Channel, like the Biography Channel, who do you think they do biographies about? Right, or people like Marilyn Monroe, right, or Anna Nicole Smith, or people like Hitler, or the Btk Killer, or Bernie Madoff, right? They don't do it on, like, Mother Teresa. I've never seen them do a documentary on Mother Teresa, okay? And they're probably not going to, either, right? And I'll tell you right now, that should tell you something right there. When Mother Teresa died, she got 1% of the coverage that Anna Nicole Smith got. I mean, that should tell you something right there about CNN and other places like that. That they were more interested in a drug-addicted blonde with a big chest who was in Playboy, who was a complete goofball. Like to me, she's like one of the Kardashians. She just didn't have the last name or something like that. Like she acts exactly like them, or like Lindsay Lohan or something like that. Who, by the way, did you hear? She says she's a homebody now. It's kind of hard to leave the house when they put a bracelet around her. Lindsay. Anyway, she does live around here, you know that, so be careful. The Lohans live, yeah, they're from Long Island. Michael Lohan, her father, has been gotten into a lot of trouble recently. He actually, at one point, was trying to sell those you ever seen these electric cigarettes? He was trying to sell those things, like out in Hamptons or something. Believe it or not, he owns a DeLorean, and he went to my mechanic. So, and he put his stupid last name on the license plate, which probably not a good idea. It's like putting O.J. Simpson on the back of your license plate. Maybe not that bad, but anyway. A key factor for television is that television drama exploits a particular style of representational realism. A dominant convention in Western narrative in general, meaning what you might know this as is the suspension of disbelief. And with special effects, it's become even more prominent. Like in Jurassic Park, what's that mean, the suspension of disbelief? What do the movie makers want you to believe?
I guess you temporarily believe that something like Jurassic Park could happen.
Yeah, it could be real, and that the special effects enhance the experience instead of take away from it. That, hey, that really looks like a King Kong or the Incredible Hulk, right? That they make Batman look very realistic to where, hey, this could be fantasy, but this is the most vivid fantasy I've ever had, right? It almost seems real. By the way, you should hear my bit about Batman. Okay. We'll talk. Batman's a murderer. He doesn't even read people's rights. He just kills them. Right?
Actually, Batman is like one rule is that he doesn't kill people.
Yeah, but in the movies he kills people.
Well, I guess in the movie they don't.
I mean, if you want to be technical with the comic book,
yeah.
But Superman usually takes people off to jail. Now, the interesting thing about Superman is that almost all of them criminals usually get out. So I understand Batman's position, that the criminal justice system is broken. And he technically does work with the chief of police, doesn't he? Still. But you have a billionaire who dresses up in a costume and kills poor people. So, poor criminals. Although some of them are wealthy. The Joker was wealthy. What? It's like Bernie Madoff or something. Anyway. If certain assumptions are taken for granted, the events taking place could happen in reality, like you were just saying. Most sitcoms and dramas require a relatively simple suspension of disbelief to get to this state. Other programs may be more fantastic, but virtually all programs share the characteristic that they present events as happening in a way that could really happen in a televised reality not too distant from our own. More importantly as well, on crime dramas, what kind of stuff do they do with lighting and music to make it even more intense, like a hyper-reality, to where, like, have you ever watched America's Most Wanted late at night by yourself? And the difference with America's Most Wanted, what's the difference when they do stuff on America's Most Wanted than on CSI? Yeah, that's real stuff there. And it's always like, and this killer's on the loose. And we don't know. I mean, you talk about paranoid. It's like paranoid TV is what it is. Like, you know, but seriously, right? What do they do with lighting and stuff on CSI and music? What's that one thing that do or whatever that noise they make? And they like do close-ups and stuff. And even in horror movies, like each horror movie villain has their own music, right? Right, and then you have the Jaws movie, and it's always dark music, and it's meant to scare the crap out of you. Like it's Halloween or something like that. Like they get the tapes of people moaning outside people's houses and stuff. So it can even be even more intense than reality, right? And I'm telling you right now, especially as a kid, if you ever remembered watching one of these crime shows or something like one of these America's Most Wanted late at night when it's dark outside and somebody hits the window, right? I mean, some people get scared about this stuff, so it goes on. Thus we can imagine Roseanne as our own mother or wife, not mine. I'll tell you that. If you're my mother, to disown you. Or we can see Seinfeld's neighborhood as our own. Further afield, we might shake our heads at some depraved and tragic criminal act that the cops on NYPD Blue encounter, even forgetting that someone scripted the deed as we mumble about how dangerous our cities have become. And even though we know Star Trek isn't real, some people think it is, within the laws of physics as we know them, we have, some people that's all their life is. We have no trouble adapting its concept. And Star Trek hasn't been on the air for like 20 years. I mean, is there a new Star Trek?
They just made a new movie, like...
Yeah, but I mean the TV show. The movie was okay. I mean, but the TV, like the Next Generation and Voyager hasn't been on for a long time. Within the laws of physics, as we know them, we have no trouble adapting its concepts, characters, and morals to everyday reality because the show is, in fact, more about today than the 24th century. So that's the element here. So it's focused on television. It's also focused on a couple other things. The impacts that television has on social perception. Particularly when it comes to crime, but not only that. So it can be things like crime, stereotypes about races. This is certainly one thing that the television likes to deal in. Also, long-term effects over time. Heavy long-term effects. And they discuss this a little bit. They discuss not only this concept of the long-term effects. I'm not going to read this part here. But this element that, look, they're looking at effects over time. People who have watched heavy amounts of TV for 20 or 30 years, not just for 2 days. Okay? But they do suggest, though, that television can have short-term effects, but they're just not interested in it. They also address, on page 37, a concern about this idea of active versus a passive audience. And what this leads into, what we'll talk about here a little bit more, is what role does people's personality play in how they interpret something? Like me, I told you. When I watch crime dramas, they make me mad. I don't even like to watch them. I think they're stupid. I think Criminal Minds is one of the worst shows I've ever seen. I can understand why it makes some people paranoid. We got enough scared, paranoid people. I mean, look, people in Idaho are afraid of Al-Qaeda. Should they be afraid of Al-Qaeda? They're afraid of their physical lives being threatened by Al-Qaeda. Do you think Al-Qaeda is going to attack Boise? Do you see the stupidity that can get into people's heads when they're scared of something that's real? And the same thing can happen with fictional reality. And the thing with Criminal Minds, you know what they say at the beginning, in Law and Order too, don't they? Don't they say this is based on a real case? Don't they say stuff like that?
No, they say it's based on it's fictional.
But it's like based on certain, some of them, I know at least one of them, I swear CSI or something says this.
Law and Order.
Is it?
Yeah.
But they fictionalize them. They change them a little bit because they have to do for dramatic tension. What?
They change their names and stuff.
Right, that's what they say. But you may be talking like CSI, maybe not be that.
Why not? It says in the beginning of the show it's fictional, but...
No, but Martin's saying that they say that they changed the names of people. And that this is based on a real case, potentially.
They say some parts of it.
Well, writers take stuff from reality anyway, right?
I mean, everything's got to come from reality somewhere. I mean,
But certainly one of the things they do, if you watch that show, is they try to make it look as realistic as possible. Although I would say there's a couple things with CSI and Law and Order. First of all, lawyers aren't that smart, and they're not that thorough, and they're not that good, and a lot of them are slime bags. that you wouldn't buy an apple off of them or leave your wife or daughter around them for more than 5 minutes unattended. And not there might be 0.1% of police precincts and departments that have all this crazy equipment. Okay, did you really think like the Hempstead Police Department has got all this stuff where they can analyze DNA? I mean, come on, they have to send that 5,000 miles away to some laboratory in Europe probably or something. I mean, my God. Anyway, but they like people to believe that. And I'll tell you another thing. Does anybody ever get away on CSI? Right? And they're always guilty, right? There's never anybody who was like wrongly accused, like what really happens in real life, where people are put on death row and they're innocent. Stuff like that. Or the fact that the FBI reports that 37% of all murders are unsolved. Go to bed with that fact in your mind. And I've heard that, and some homicide detectives will tell you this, if you murder a stranger with no motive or no connection to him and nobody witnesses it, and you can get away with it for 48 hours, you're pretty much scot-free.
Really?
Yeah, probably shouldn't tell people that. Anyway, with this idea of, look, if I'm not afraid of crime, do you think that watching CSI is going to make me afraid of crime? So maybe people who watch crime shows are already afraid of crime in the first place, right? Maybe that's what's going on here. That's the cart before the horse. Okay? But also the fact is, look, maybe there's elements of both active and passive audience participation. I would say with the internet, people are much more active. You're searching for things active. When you watch TV, what's your mood like? What's your mindset when you sit down on the couch? Maybe you lay out, right? What's your mindset? Are your defenses up? No, they're down. So there is an element of maybe passiveness. If we have time, I'll read that and talk about that a little bit more. I do want to move on here to the last part of this here is this concept that this is potentially a conflict approach or a critical theoretical approach to TV. Meaning that it criticizes it and it says that one of the reasons why this is occurring, and you can see this on page 15, is because the system is controlled. And it says right here on page 15, cultivation research is more than an abstract examination of an interesting question. Rather, we see cultivation as a critical theory of communication insofar as it subjects the institution of television and mass communication to an investigation which can show the dimensions of important problems and even suggest ways to fix them. While cultivation does not look like the average critical theory, at least in communication, most critical studies tend towards interpretive or abstract examinations of social processes. Cultivation passes the entrance exam for critical social science research. Above, we suggested that traditional mass communication researchers were often motivated by their unstated political agenda, but of course we too are motivated by an ideo-political agenda, the nature of which is fundamental to understanding cultivation. In this section we explore some assumptions that underpin the research, and it goes on down here. It says, if cultivation is a critical theory, it is a theory of media's role in social control. Do you think that the government wants people to be afraid of crime? And afraid of the ramifications of committing crime?
Yeah.
What's the benefits to a society of having people afraid of crime?
Most people commit crime.
Potentially, right?
There
What
ought
else?
to be more, they'd want to back up the law enforcement, I guess?
So the police could potentially get away with more things that might be questionable. Right? You might also support funding for police officers more. So those elements there. Maybe you go out of the house less if you're afraid of crime, which may be a detriment to the economy, but certainly you're more likely to see government officials and police officers and law enforcement officials as protectors instead of people who are like enforcing some status quo. Okay, so certainly that's part of it. That is, it examines how media are used in social systems to build consensus. So there's another thing. That television builds consensus around political issues like the bailout, right? That's an element of social control. But here's another thing that Marx would say. Television diminishes the capacity for class conflict, or diminishes class conflict. Why? Why does television, why can you accuse television of diminishing class conflict? Are there a lot of movies about class and unions and stuff like that? Are there a lot of TV shows about class conflict that discuss class and talk about upper and middle class and lower class lifestyles? Some, maybe like Roseanne and stuff like that. But are there any real critical analysis of the inequality in this country on TV?
No, but there's kind of like examples that show the inequality.
Like what?
Like the show on MTV, Cribs, how like it shows like all these ridiculously
But it's almost an enticement of, hey,
Yeah.
you too, even if you're homeless, can have this, right? As long as you play by the rules, or do something innovative or interesting, right?
Yeah, I guess.
At least it holds that up as, you too can have this, right? That you should want to have this. But you could also, if you were a more active audience member, go, isn't that despicable that that's the way some people live, right? Or just the idea of the two-party system. That's something that's certainly in force. Anyway, we argue that the system works so as to benefit social elites. Boy, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? What's that sound like? What's that sound like? What theory? What theoretical perspective? Not only conflict, but power elite theory, right? From C. Ray Mills. These elites are not a mysterious cabal enmeshed in pernicious conspiracies. They are simply the haves of global industrial society who enjoy its benefits disproportionately. In this section, we advance some simple propositions that specify how cultivation contributes to processes of social control through which these elite groups tend to retain their power and privileges. You can bet I'm going to ask you something about this kind of stuff, so you want to mark that page there. Now, just quickly to go over what the definition of simple cultivation theory on page 3 here. You want to mark this page here. And it's sort of an example. It's basically this. First full paragraph. This conceptualization of the role of television in our lives is the essence of George Gerbner's theory of cultivation. This simple hypothesis that watching a great deal of television will be associated with a tendency to hold specific and distinct conceptions of reality, conceptions that are congruent with the most consistent and pervasive images and values of the medium. What they're saying is, heavy viewers tend to have views of reality that are similar to the television. And you can see how out of whack that is. Is television reality? Television is like a subcultural, like a socially constructed, institutionally constructed subculture, isn't it? Like, do people really act like that on Jersey from Jersey Shore? Do people really act like that? Do most people, let me put it another way, do most people act like that? Right? Right. And on Big Brother, is that reality or is that unreality? Yeah. In Survivor, is that reality? But I love it. They call them reality shows. There's nothing real about it. And nobody's dumping a big bucket of snakes and cockroaches on top of me. I don't care how much. It better be billions, and it better be in cash, and it better be sitting on the table when I get done with these stupid snakes. And then what I'm going to do with the billions of dollars is I'm going to buy the show and destroy it, and then I'm going to probably hire some people to beat the producer up for dumping snakes on me or something like that. So you ain't going to give me $50,000 to dump. And they make them like drink rotten eggnog and all kinds of crap. I mean, you've seen the show. It's disgusting. Or like American Idol. Is that really how you get famous? Is that how most people get famous in reality? Is that how Elton John got famous? Is that how Madonna made it?
Yeah, but you're talking about 2 different generations now.
Still, though, there's a lot of people who don't... Taylor Swift didn't go on American Idol. Did she? Justin Bieber didn't go on American Idol. Most people don't get famous that way. Seriously, they just don't.
No, Justin Bieber started on YouTube, didn't he?
Still, I mean, that's not American Idol, though.
Okay, so it's YouTube.
I mean, it's still different. It's still different. Anyway, so may at first glance appear to be so thoroughly reasonable and self-evident that one may be tempted to wonder what all the fuss is about. Who could possibly argue against such a cut-and-dried assertion? Why write a book about something so obvious? This idea that people watch a lot of TV impacts their behavior. Yet obviousness notwithstanding, cultivation theory and research have become a major arena in which questions about the effects of television have been debated. Indeed, although the elegant simplicity of the idea has both attracted adherents and antagonized opponents, cultivation analysis has also been an extraordinary controversial approach to media effects and communication research, and not only within the narrow confines of the academic community. After over 20 years of intense theoretical and methodological development, testing, criticism, and refinement, it turns out that cultivation is neither so simple nor so obvious. In the time-honored tradition of good scientific progress, the more work that is done, the more complex the questions. What they're trying to say is that cultivation changes over time. But let me give you an example of what kind of stuff makes it on to local news programs. This is a serial killer. His name is the Btk Killer. He actually named himself. BTK stands for bind them, torture them, and kill them. He was a former ADT security officer. He worked as a compliance officer in the city. He murdered a couple people on his lunch break one time. He used to, for some of his victims, he used to break in their house and wait in the closet. And wait for them to open the closet door and jump out on them and strangle them. I mean, you talk about a serious horror show. Alright, so let me play part of this. Here is him describing, the judge forced him to describe his murders and the local news was there to capture it.
On that particular day, the 15th day of January, 1974, can you tell me where you went to kill Mr. Joseph Otero?
I think it's 1834. Edgemore.
All right. Can you tell me approximately what time of day you went there?
Somewhere between 7 and 7:30.
In the morning.
This particular location, did you know these people?
No, that's
This guy killed 11 people. He's
well,
talking
that
like
was part of my,
making breakfast.
I guess my what's called fantasy. These people were selected.
All right. So you
Does this make you feel
you
safe?
were engaged in some kind of fantasy during this period of time?
Yes, sir.
All right. Now, when you use the term fantasy, is this something you were doing for your personal pleasure?
Sexual fantasy, sir.
I see. So you went to this residence, and what occurred then?
Well, I had did some thinking on what I was going to do to either Mrs. Otero or Josephine, and
Which was
basically
like a
broke into the
6-year-old
house.
girl.
I didn't break into the house, but when they
Killed
came out of
kids,
the house,
just-
I came in and confronted the family, and then we went from there.
All right. Had you planned this beforehand?
To some degree, yes. After I got in the house, I lost control of it, but it was, you know, back in my mind, I had some ideas what I was going to do, but I basically panicked that first day, so.
Beforehand,
This is
did
his
you know
first murder.
who was there in the house?
I thought Mrs. Otero and the two kids, the two younger kids were in the house. I didn't realize Mr. Otero was going to be there.
All right. How did you get into the house?
I came to the back door, cut the phone lines, waited at the back door, had reservations about even going or just walking away, but pretty soon the door opened and I was in.
All
You
right.
live
So
near Gilgo
the
Beach.
door
huh?
open, was it open
Like
for
he
you?
was
Or did
around.
I think one of the kids, I think the,
It probably looks as unassuming as that.
Junior-
Did you think that guy was a
Junior,
murderer?
yes.
You saw him at a restaurant? He was actually the head of his church,
the
too, and a
younger
Boy Scout leader.
Joseph opened the door. He
One of
probably
his
let the dog
expertise
out.
was tying
The dog
knots.
was in the house at that time.
all right. When you went into the house, what happened?
He was married, too,
So I confronted the family,
for over 2
pistol,
decades, and had kids.
confronted Mr. Otero, and
This is the face of
asked him
serial
to,
killer.
let I was there to, basically, I was wanted to get the car, I was hungry, food, I was wanted, and asked him to lie down in the living room. And at that time, I realized that wasn't a really good idea, so I finally, the dog was a real problem, so I asked Mr. Otero if he could get the dog out, so he had one of the kids put it out. And I took him back to the bedroom.
You took who back to the bed?
The family, the bedroom, the 4 members.
All right. What happened then?
And at that time, I tied him up.
While still holding him at gunpoint?
Well, in between tying and yes. Yeah.
All right. After you tied him up, what occurred?
Well, they started complaining about being tied up, and I re-loosened the bonds a couple of times. Tried to make Mr. Otero as comfortable as I could. Apparently had a cracked rib from a car accident, so I had him put a pillow down for his head. Had he put a
It's good that serial killers nice to his
Parker
victims.
coat underneath him.
This is,
Uh,
to most people, this was the creepiest
Yeah.
thing ever.
They talked to me about, giving